Okay, so let's talk about some last wrap-up objections to divine command theory. Classical Christian theism is committed to an understanding of God on which God has certain omni-characteristics. God is omnipotent, for instance, on classical Christian theism, which means that he's all-powerful. This doesn't mean that God can do anything. God can't square a circle. He can't make 2 plus 2 equals 7. God can't necessarily make false equal true and true equal false. So he can't make logical incompatibilities reconciled. But omnipotence means he can do pretty much anything else. One other thing, God can't sin. Omnipotence means that he can do pretty much anything else. And divine command theory might potentially undermine God's omnipotence. How could it do so? Because it seems as though divine command theory is something that makes God's omnipotence preeminent. Well, the objection here is that if we say, it's an objection to coextension-based divine command theory. If we say that God would not and indeed cannot command evil for its own sake, which is what the coextension theorists suggest, then this strikes some as being inconsistent with the belief that God is omnipotent. They ask, how could there be anything that an omnipotent being could not do? Okay, and here it's the response, the standard response that's given is something that Aquinas articulates nicely. Okay, when Aquinas says in the prima pars of the Summa, he says we have to consider the precise meaning of all things when we say that God can do all things. To say that God can do all things is to say that he can do all things that are possible and not those that are impossible. And the answer here is that God cannot make impossible things happen. And so we need to reorder our understanding of what omnipotence actually means. There's some other objections as well. Okay, so what do we mean to say that God is all good? This is an objection to the voluntaristic interpretation of divine command theory. What do we mean to say that God is all good? If God could potentially make a command that seems so self-evidently morally wrong that it would completely undermine our understanding of what goodness is, to interpret it as being good and as issuing from a good God. So when God, the problem that so many of us have when we look at Old Testament passages where God says to kill the Canaanites is that this seems to be a command to do an immoral thing. At least prima facie it seems like that, unless you say that there's a background story where the Israelites are acting as state executioners for people who deserve death by virtue of having slaughtered innocents, or something, some other background story that you tell like that. But if God is commanding them to do an immoral thing, the voluntarist divine command theorists say it's not actually an immoral thing because God commanded it. It is actually moral precisely because God commanded it. And this has struck many objectors as being incompatible with what divine omnibenevolence ought to mean. I don't have a problem intellectually with God commanding things and making them moral by virtue of his command, but there certainly is a visceral problem, non-intellectual visceral problem, with the notion that God could command what I have my whole life believed to be right to suddenly be wrong, and the opposite to be right, and making that the case. That certainly strikes me as being very unlike what a God who is, I believe him to be at least transparent, unlike what a God who is transparent would do. It seems more the sort of thing that a deceptive deity would do rather than a deity who's being straightforward with us. And if there's anything that's central to the Christian message, it is the notion that God is a truth teller, and that God is trying to, trying to offer us a true understanding of the world in incarnating himself in the world in the form of a human being and suffering and dying on our behalf. Okay, so although intellectually I'm okay with the notion of God commanding right to be wrong and wrong to be right and making them the opposite of what I've always myself believed to be the case, still viscerally that strikes me as being very rough. And for that reason, I don't think God is playing another game than we are, morally speaking. I think he's playing the same game as we are, and I don't think he would instill in us a moral sense that is precisely the opposite of what he actually intended to be the case, ultimately, morally. So, in response to that sort of a query or an objection, I tend to side with the coextension people who say it just must not be the case that that the truth is a voluntaristic God. That just must not be the case. Rather, what must be the case is that God too must be constrained, and God's constraints must be his inability to do immoral things. That must be the constraints, the nature of the constraints that are upon God. There's some spin-offs that come out of divine command theory. I mentioned at the end of last class session a proof for the existence of God based on morality. And the idea there is that if objective values exist, there must be something that grounds those objective values, and God must exist because only God can ground such objective values. That's a very interesting proof, I think, for God's existence. It's got lots of different ramifications and different pieces and bits. It's a bit of a side issue, though, for our purposes in this class, although it's valuable to explore in its own part. But because we're going to move on to Hauerwas today, I'm just going to kind of leave my exploration of it last time where it was and just throw that out there in case you guys are interested in investigating further on your own the moral argument for God's existence. Are there any comments or questions about divine command theory? Cameron?
So for the first objection, whether he's all-powerful enough, the problem is like whether he can do these things or not. Couldn't you just make the distinction that there's a difference between ability and possibility, and then say omnipotency is just a modal concept, meaning you only need to have the ability to do such things? But then you could say, well, God in his good nature doesn't have the possibility to do such things, but he still retains the ability, which is perfectly consistent with omnipotence being a modal concept.
Yeah, it could. But wouldn't you think, though, in response to that not having the actual practical ability to do something, God would never do it. So how can we argue that there is a legitimate reason for thinking that he has the ability to do it? Does that make sense? Like, in order for us a choice to be a live choice, for me, I actually have to have the real ability to do otherwise than what I want to do in order for it to be a live choice. I don't understand. I guess I don't understand.
The distinction between ability and possibility?
Yeah, I don't understand a distinction between ability and possibility that doesn't actually give me some sort of real other option where I could really do otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't work out on libertarian terms for sure. So if you're a compatibilist, then I think it would make more sense. But it's just basically saying, so like take an example of like a mother and her child. The mother has the ability to strangle her child because it's within her physical capabilities. But would she ever strangle her child? It's like, well, no, because that goes against her nature. Thus, she doesn't have the possibility of enacting on that ability that she does have.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the distinction.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I see the metaphor. I don't think it's really possible for her to strangle her child unless she actually could strangle her child. And I think it is really possible for a human mother to do that because I think she's got a sin nature, and some mothers do strangle their children.
Yeah.
But if God, at the end of the day, will not strangle the kid, if God's in the place of the mother, then he's not like really able to do it. If there is no possible world in which he would strangle the kid, then I'm not sure that it has actual valence. Anyway, I can think about it further, but that would be my first response to that. Let's talk today. Let me stop the video.